Okay, so in this unit, we are going to be talking about the prehistoric Aegean. And like I said when we started the ancient Egypt and Kingdom of Kush unit, we have some overlap in this class, okay? So like within each module, it's fairly chronological, but some of the things in the later Neolithic overlap with ancient Egypt and the Kingdom of Kush. They also overlap some with the prehistoric Aegean. So we're kind of stepping back in time, going to another region, and then moving forward again, which is going to happen a little bit throughout the semester because we're trying to get a lot of information that happened in a lot of different places in a very wide span of time into one class. And in this case, it is a rather short 8-week class. So it's a lot of kind of back and forth. All right, so the prehistoric Aegean, gods, monsters, and the origins of Greek mythology. Let's get into it. First of all, let's talk about what Aegean means, figure out who Ajeus was, and then we can kind of sort out where the Aegean Sea is located and what we're talking about. So several of you, I'm sure, maybe all of you, are aware that Aegean means in related or in proximity to the Aegean Sea, okay? And the Aegean Sea is a body of water that's connected to the Mediterranean. So we've got the body of water that's like right next to Greece, basically. I'll show you a map in the next slide. Why is it called the Aegean Sea? Well, there was this guy. His name was Ajeus. Ajeus literally means goat man, which is kind of funny. You know how I like words and like to tell you what words literally mean, because sometimes it's sort of funny, like goat man is a little strange. And so he was a king in these times, these prehistoric times, kind of pre-Greece, basically. And his son, who we'll talk about a little more later, Theseus, sails off from the Greek mainland to go and defeat the Minotaur on the island of Crete. Okay, so the Minotaur is this monster. We'll talk about it a little bit later as well, but basically children from King Aegeus's city were sent every so many years to be fed to this Minotaur monster as part of a kind of shady agreement he had with another king named King Minos, who we'll also talk about more later. So his son is like, Dad, this is stupid. We should stop feeding children to this monster. I'll just go kill the monster. And so he goes, and I'll tell you about what happens later. But essentially the agreement, because this is prehistoric times, so there's not a whole lot of great long-distance communication available, is on his ship, Theseus, the son's ship, when he's sailing back, he's going to put up white sails if he's okay and black sails if he's been killed. Well, he forgets to change his sails to tell his dad he's okay, so his dad sees the sails coming, thinks his son has been killed by the Minotaur, and he decides to die by suicide, and he jumps off his balcony into the nearest body of water to kill himself, and that nearest body of water is what is now called the Aegean Sea. So it's named after Aegeus because that is where he died. So it's a very tragic story. A lot of these stories are going to be pretty tragic, where we're getting into where a bunch of Greek mythology and tragedies come from. Okay, so we know what the Aegean Sea is. Okay, let's look at where it is. Here's the Aegean Sea. So we see the Mediterranean. You can see on the little globe in the corner where we're at. So we're a little north of where we were last time, because we were in Africa and Egypt and what is now the Sudan and the Kingdom of Kush. And now we're up a little further now north, but in southern Europe. We're around what is now Greece. But specifically, we're looking at what is now the Greek mainland. It was not that yet at this time. And we're looking at a couple different groups of islands. So I'm going to do this introduction, what we're doing right now, and then I'm going to tell you about one of these groups of one of these cultures that we're going to talk about, and then I'll break the rest up into other smaller lectures. So basically, we're looking at the Aegean Sea and the cultures that developed in the prehistoric times, kind of in keeping with the Neolithic age, on these islands and on the mainlands that sort of surround these islands, and the interrelationship between all of them and what their artwork and architecture looked like, and how that contributed to what later becomes our mainstay ancient Greek culture and their mythology and things like this. So what do you know about myths and monsters of the Aegean? Probably kind of a lot. You probably know more than you think. pop culture has had kind of a heyday with things from this time period. So we have things like Clash of the Titans, which they remade recently, but was a terrifically bad kind of 80s movie with lots of stop motion monsters and things when I was a kid that I actually kind of loved. We have the Percy Jackson books. We have all kinds of pop culture references to what's happening. But the main thing is, are you familiar with Homer? So a million years ago, when I was in high school, we read the Odyssey in high school. We didn't read the Iliad, which I always thought was odd, but we did read the Odyssey. I read the Iliad and the Odyssey again in college, I think. So I don't know if they still make people read the Odyssey. I get kind of a mixed response from my students in seated classes. But Homer is, I'm not talking about the top guy here, who's Homer Simpson from the cartoon The Simpsons. I'm talking about Homer, who was the ancient Greek author, right, the poet. So he wrote epic poems, which means really, really long poems, and most famously the Odyssey and the Iliad, right? So Homer is from a later time period than what we're about to talk about, but he based a lot of his writing, his stories, his mythology on people and mythological entities, gods, goddesses, and monsters that were supposed to have lived in his kind of home turf, which is Greece and the Aegean. So he bases a lot of his writing on what happened in the time before him, okay, so in the prehistoric time. So he's a pretty important figure, and we're going to find that some of the sources of the famous myths and things that he writes about, the stories that he ends up writing down, are actually based in misinterpretations of artworks and architectural works, which is kind of cool. Okay, so the three main categories of the prehistoric Aegean art are Cycladic, Minoan, and Helladic. So we're going to talk about Cycladic right now, and the other two I'm going to do in two additional separate short lectures, so that this isn't like a ton of information for you to take in at once. Cycladic refers to work from a group of islands called the Cyclades, which are in the middle of the Aegean. We'll talk about them in a minute. Minoan is a culture of people who populated the island of Crete before it was Crete, basically. So we'll talk about them in a separate lecture. And then Helladic means anything on what is now the Greek mainland. So we're going to talk about some specific cultures from this time period there, but collectively work created on what is now the Greek mainland is called Helladic from this period. Okay? All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Cyclades. I don't go into a whole lot of work from here in this lecture. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples, and then later when we're talking about the Minoans, we're going to look at some painting and some architectural examples from here. But in terms of artwork from the Cyclades specifically, we're just going to look at a couple of sculptures. That's why I'm kind of grouping it in with the intro here. Okay, so here's a map of Greece, of what Greece looks like today. And the islands in red are the Cyclades, okay? And then on the right, we have a map of the Cyclades kind of zoomed in. So it's quite a few islands. What do you think this name means? Let me think about it for a second. What does it kind of look like? Cyclades kind of looks like cycle, which is the same root as circle. So the islands are kind of arranged in a circle. It's a little bit of a wonky circle, but it's kind of a circle. So that's why they're called the Cyclades. So we're going to talk about a couple of these islands in particular a little later. Specifically, we're going to look at Thera. We're going to talk about Thera more when we talk about the Minoans, even though it's part of the Cyclades. And something happens there that has a big impact on everything in the region. And we're going to talk about Naxos. And we're going to look at some examples from, I think, Syros and Keros, okay? So we're just going to look at a couple of these. All right, so here's a couple of examples that we're going to look at. So we have, first of all, let's talk just a little bit about Naxos. So Naxos is not where these sculptures are from exactly, but it's where the material they're made out of is from. So Naxos is that biggest island that's kind of in the middle. You can see it there. And it has a lot of marble quarries. So it is important in terms of art and architectural history for many years to come, and in this time period as well, because it was the source of a lot of this white marble that's sort of omnipresent when we think about classical sculpture and architecture, and particularly ancient Greek sculpture and architecture. So the source of a lot of this white marble is Naxos in the Cyclades. All of the Cycladic islands have similar styles of sculpture. There's lots and lots and lots of these figures, like the two that are pictured here, that have been found in the various on the various islands of the Cyclades. So first, let's look at the Syros woman. Sorry, my text is cut off a little bit. I transferred this from a Apple file to a PC file, and it's like messed up my text a little bit. I apologize. But this is the Syros woman, S-Y-R-O-S. So Syros is one of the Cycladic islands, and she's carved out of marble. Marble's very hard. So what are they carving this with? They're carving it with obsidian tools. So obsidian is a metamorphic rock that's black, that's very, very hard. So they would make tools to carve these early sculptures with out of obsidian. If you look at her, if we look at the form overall and look at the shapes within it, she's kind of composed of triangles. She has kind of a triangular head. She has sort of a triangle from across her shoulders down to the tips of her toes. She has a triangular kind of pubic area. She's very angular and is basically composed of triangles. She's carved out of marble. There are lots of different sizes of these kind of figures. This one is pretty typical of what they look like. Parts of them were painted, so there's remnants of paint where we know that there was painting on the faces and painted on jewelry adornments. So they were kind of, it's not that they were portrayed as nude, but with painted makeup and jewelry on. Particularly, they had little dots on their cheeks, so a dot here surrounded by several other dots, and their lips were painted. So it's not, it's debated what they were, what their function was. So some think that they were portraits of specific people. Some think that they were fertility figures. That's kind of always where sculptures of women in prehistory, people are like, oh, it must be a fertility rite. Maybe it was, we don't know. Some think maybe it's a goddess. The most prevalent theory, because these are found in a lot of burial sites, is that these were kind of, not exactly offerings, but like a stand-in for people to show respect to the deceased, or maybe to pray to the gods on behalf of the deceased. So they were included in the burial either as sort of like the Ka sculptures that we looked at with Egypt, someplace for the spirit to live, but a lot of scholars think that they were more like a tribute, like here I am praying for this person to the gods so that they have a good afterlife. The statue will be the stand-in for that act of worship. One of the reasons that is the thought is that there are also sculptures that look more like the one on the right. So this is the Keros man, K-E-R-O-S, so that's the island where he was found. And take a look at him, what is he doing? He's a little bit more complicated than the Syros woman. He's seated in a chair, and we can see some detail about the way the chair is constructed, which tells us a little bit about their kind of level of woodworking and things that they had at this time. And he's holding something on his lap. His hands have been lost to time, but from paintings and other things that are contemporaneous with this, we know that what he's holding is a harp, and the harp has the head of a swan on it. So it's a harp with some kind of animal kind of figuration in its design. So why would this be found in a tomb? Well, kind of like with this idea of someone sort of, a statue being a stand-in for continued worship and prayer for the deceased person to have a good afterlife, one thought is this is like an offering of music. So this statue is like having someone to permanently play music for the gods or for maybe the person in the afterlife. So it's kind of a tribute in some ways. Other scholars think maybe it's because the person who was deceased who was buried there was a musician, and so this is kind of showing what they were like in their life. As I said, it's not totally known. Interestingly enough, the male sculptures are never thought to be related to fertility, so it's not that, they think. These are two fairly typical Cycladic type sculptures. You'll notice they're made out of the same material. They range in size quite a lot, but this is the kind of thing that we find in these islands. Okay, so next we will talk about the Minoans, and then we will talk about the Helladic, the mainland.